Whistle Down the Wind is 50 years old this year. One of the peaks of an altogether extraordinary and exceptional career of many, many peaks, which is celebrated tonight here with the award of the BFI's fellowship to Bryan Forbes.
I would like to say to Greg Dyke, his colleagues and counsel, what great honour the BFI do to me tonight, and I'm very sorry that ill health prevents me from being there in person. But thank you all for doing me this great honour, which I appreciate more than I can say. You know, because when you're 85, as I am, it's like Betty Davis once said to me, old age ain't for sissies. But thank you, Greg, and thank all of you who've taken the trouble to arrange this evening. I'm more than grateful.
What sort of a world were you born into?
Well, my father was a commercial traveller. I went to West Ham Secondary School, and it wasn't until I went down to Cornwall as an evacuee with the school, and we had a very good drama teacher called Miss Bray, and she put me in a play where I was cast as Shylock, and the local critic said, possibly the greatest Shylock of his generation. And this went to my head, rather.
Yes.
And I wrote to everybody, people in the Radio Times, because they were the only people I knew I could write to. I wrote to Tommy Handley,
Wow.
Sir Malcolm Sargent, you know.
That's wonderful.
And finally to Lionel Gamlin, who then used to do, you know, British Movie Tone News and other things,
All right.
and was a big lardy producer
Yeah, yeah.
at BBC. And he said he was so amazed by my letter and by the notice, he felt he'd got to see me.
I bet.
So he gave me a solemn audition at the BBC and took me out for a coffee and bun and said, you realise you're starved to death as an actor, don't you? And helped me get into RADA.
How old were you?
Well, let me think. 16?
Right.
16.
But you went to RADA nonetheless.
I got a scholarship, I got a Leaverium scholarship,
Yeah, yeah.
which I think paid £3 a week, which you couldn't live on.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I took a job. I took a job as an understudy, which you weren't allowed to do, in a play called Junior Miss at the Phoenix Theatre. And old Sir Kenneth Barnes, who ran RADA, brought me in and said, you're fired. You've lost your scholarship by taking a job.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
After how long?
And I'll make your name mud, he said. He was full of charm and, you know, good spirits towards young actors.
Did it do you any good?
Well, I had such a terrible Cockney accent, I suppose it ironed that out. And what it did do, don't forget this is during the war, and I knew I was going to be called up. So I suppose by then I was about 17 maybe, and there were only, I think, 14 boys.
Oh, yes, yes.
And about 200 girls, so we had quite a good time. And I was called up, you know.
And then you were called up. This is the thing that, even for my generation, is still the shocking thought that young men of your age, 17, went into the war, into the armed forces and into...
And expected to die.
But exactly, which must be a life-changing
Well, it
experience.
was, yes. It was a strange time.
And were you thinking during all that time, oh, I'll go back to the theatre, I'll be an actor?
Well, I was very lucky. I had a very good agent called Olive Harding. And when I was demobbed, I went from collecting this hideous suit and trilby hat and awful shoes, which I immediately sold, and she'd got me a job immediately. I went from Aldershot being demobbed straight to London to a rehearsal for a play called Gathering Storm, which curiously was produced by Sam Goldwyn Jr. Isn't that weird?
Gosh. In the West End?
Oh yes, at the St Martin's.
What? Yeah, that's fantastic. It's a
And,
good start, isn't it? I mean,
Yes, except it starred Nancy Price, and she was known as Nancy Not at Any Price. And she used to hit me on stage. I played a sort of boy who was a bit delally and spoke most of my dialogue to a dog and was accused wrongly of murdering her. And then I got a film part at Pinewood all over the town, which sort of at the same time simultaneously almost launched my film career.
Mm-hmm. You then cracked in, you would be the envy of other young actors, because there you were in a West End play and in a movie straight away. People took to you straight away.
They did. I think I was a bit unique. A lot of actors hadn't gone into the war, and I think anybody who did was regarded with much more respect for some reason.
Yeah.
And I got lots of jobs. I was very seldom out of work, actually, for years, either films or plays.
And what sort of an actor did you see yourself as being?
Well, a star. We all.
Right.
I never was. I mean, I was a big featured player, but never a star.
Right.
I always wanted to be.
You were obviously meeting people, actors, you know, that you were drawn to and so on, and one of them was Dickie, which is obviously a very important friendship.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And how did you meet Dickie Attenborough?
On a film called The Baby and the Battleship, which I had half written.
Did you then, between you, start to think about going into production?
Yes, we did. We used to spend our holidays together on a little beach called La Garoupe. And while we were there, we both decided, probably arrogantly, that we knew more than a lot of the directors who directed us. And we started to look for subjects. The first 3 subjects we found floundered. They went nowhere. And then we hit upon Whistle Down the Wind, and we hit upon Willis Hall and Keith Waterhouse, and gave them the script to write because they were North Country, and they were brilliant because the novel that Mary Haley Bell wrote was a rather smart novel set in Sussex in a very rich farm.
Right.
And we didn't think that would work. And Keith and Willis agreed with us, and they said, let us try it up north. Isolate the children.
Yeah.
And I thought wrote a brilliant screenplay.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
But also you directed it.
Yes.
And so you, for the first time, you were working with the cinematographer.
Great cinematographer, Arthur Ibbotson.
Yes. Did you feel this is a medium that I really
Yes,
know and embrace?
I grew into it.
Yeah.
I knew quite a lot about filmmaking because I'd made so many films.
Yes.
And therefore, I knew what to avoid.
Yes.
And I remember saying to Arthur, so what I'd like to do, Arthur, is a shot which starts there, turns all the way round, and he said, do it. Do it. You know, he was a great mentor to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I was so lucky throughout my career of the number of great cameramen I worked with.
Yeah. Before that, though, you'd written screenplays.
Oh, many.
Yes. How did that come about?
The first offer I had was from Cubby Broccoli while I was in Hollywood making a film with dear old Raoul Walsh. And he said, can you write me a script on the Cockleshell Heroes? And I said, well, I'll try. And I sat down and put a towel around my head and wrote a script which miraculously he liked and was made rather improbably with Jose Ferrer playing an English commander. Ludicrous casting. That was my first screen credit.
But how did he think that you would be able to do such a thing?
Because he'd read my book of short stories.
Had he?
So it all sort of jigsawed in
Yeah.
and came together. by chance, really.
Right,
I was
right.
lucky, yeah.
Were you conscious of your contemporaries? Because this is just the beginning of what was the sort of great new wave of British filmmaking.
Well, I was conscious they were around, but there was no collusion. I mean, I never met with Tony Richardson or Carol Rice and those people.
Yeah.
We never all got together for a
Yeah.
drink and a talk. We never talked about each other's films while they were being made.
Because they sort of, not Carol, but the others like Lindsay Anderson and Tony all knew each other from
Lindsay
the
I knew very well.
Aha. They had a kind of Royal Court
And
theatre background.
his
which
boyfriend, Gavin Lambert.
Yes.
Now, we were innovative in that, for example, on Séance and a Wet Afternoon, I don't think anybody had shot in the West End like we did,
Yeah.
on tops of buses and
Yeah.
places like that.
Yeah.
We did it out of necessity, mostly, because we didn't have the money.
Yes. Now, those are your contemporaries,
Yes.
and you, as you say, you were all aware of each other, but you weren't especially influenced by each other's work. You were just the young people making movies at the time. But did you have heroes among other filmmakers?
Oh, yes.
Like whom?
Carol Reed.
Yeah. Yes.
Carol.
Yes, I can see that very clearly. That you're in his vein.
Yes. Carol gave me very good advice when I was directing. He said never cut for an actor. He always carried coins in his pocket and he would drop them and say, "Cut! Can we keep the set quiet?" And then he'd come up to you and he'd say, "While we've stopped, why don't we do it this way?"
Of the other, of the sort of classics, were you aware of Jean Renoir and...
Yes, I used to go to the old Academy Cinema in Oxford Street, almost every week.
Yeah.
And most of the filming that influenced me was French.
Yeah.
Jeux interdits,
Yes.
that definitely influenced me.
Yes.
I think you'll see in Whistle Down the Wind a couple of shots of children running towards camera,
Yes.
which were very influenced by that.
You've always created a wonderful feeling on all of your films of an ensemble of actors. There's always a feeling of ease and a wonderful chemistry of casting.
Well, I suppose because I was an actor, firstly, I've always believed that, okay, critics are very impressed by the camera movement and what have you. Audiences are impressed by performances. You know, if the performance is good, it'll get you out of trouble. If the performance is bad, and therefore I always had great respect for actors and also felt that they should be treated. I was always furious until I became much more important that I would go on a set and there would be somebody who's only got a day's work, right? And I would see him sitting on a camera box. And I said to the prop man, "Why hasn't he got a chair?" "Oh, well, governor, you know, I said, "No, give him a chair with his name on it. He's immediately 10 foot taller and will, you know, give a better performance."
Yeah. But you'd always thought of yourself. The way you start a divided life is you said I'm an actor who became a writer, who became a director, who became a screenwriter. A screenwriter who became a
Yes, that's true.
So look, Whistle Down There was a big success immediately. So your first film is a triumph as a director.
Yes.
What was the immediate consequence of that?
Well, the immediate consequence was that Jimmy Wolfe said, "I'm tired of waiting for Jack Clayton to make up his mind. Why don't you do The L-Shaped Room?"
Yes.
I got that by default.
All right.
And had to audition for it with Leslie Caron and Peter Hall, I remember. Had to go to dinner with them and he cross-examined me. Yeah.
But you passed with flying colours.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, Leslie remembers it as one of the great experiences of her
Yes,
career
yes.
as an actor.
Yes.
And she's
She was very good in it.
extraordinary. Well, everybody is. It's
Yes.
fantastic. L-shaped room, another huge success. So you're absolutely
I'm
very
launched.
quickly established
Yeah.
as absolutely one of the leading British directors and actually world directors, because these films went round the world.
Yes.
Huge, huge success. So what's your next move then? What do you think to yourself?
Well, then Dickie and I made Séance on a wet afternoon, which I thought was going to be a failure.
Did you?
Yeah, I got on the boat because I was going to do King Rat. And when I'd finished cutting it, and before it opened in London, I got on the boat, got on the Queen Mary and thought, I won't be here when it's a disaster.
Really?
Yes, isn't that weird? I had no idea it would be a success.
You made a substantial number of very successful films. Did you start to think in terms of wanting perhaps to run a studio?
No, I never did. That was beyond my wildest surmises. But I was at the old White Elephant restaurant one night, and Bernard Delfont came up to me. I had a long chat, and after he'd gone, Nanette said, "What was that about?" I said, "Well, he's just bought EMI, well, ABC as it then was, and asked if I would like to run the studio." And she said, "What did you say?" And I said, "Well, I hadn't really thought about it, but I would write a paper stating what I thought had to be done."
Yes.
And when it was about 40 pages I wrote and gave it to him, and he was amazed and said, "Well," but I didn't realise that he was making enemies for me because he'd promised the job to Nat Cohen, who was never on my side, unfortunately, and he was on the board. And it could have been a great enterprise, but I'm afraid there was so much chicanery going on behind the scenes, which is sad because in many ways it revitalised a very ailing British film industry at the time, and I made 18 negatives there for £4 million.
Good God. Good.
And some of them were very successful. I mean, Railway Children to this day,
Good.
The Go-Between,
Yes.
Tales of Beatrix Potter.
Yes.
There were several very good films there which I inaugurated, and several which were thrown to the wolves. They just wouldn't support me.
It does seem like one of those great lost opportunities.
Yes, it was, I think.
But did it leave you with a bitter taste in your mouth?
It left me exhausted, I remember.
Yeah.
I remember when finally I left, we took off for Barbados. And I stayed there a month just really to get my health back. Because when I took over the studio, it was a shambles.
Yes.
You could have caught the room they gave me, you could have caught athlete's foot without taking his shoes off. It was awful. It's a dreadful, run-down place.
But then you started to write novels.
I did. I had a great spurt, and I wrote a trilogy. I wrote all sorts of novels very quickly. I had this very fertile period, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
I've just written a novel. Of course, now you can't get published anywhere. I've written a rather good novel, I think, called The Soldier's Story.
It's a very different sort of satisfaction, isn't it?
Yes.
Especially writing a novel, which I've never done. I've never had the courage, really, to write fiction.
It's a long haul.
Yeah.
In terms of imagination.
Yes, yes.
Sometimes you're lucky.
Yeah.
You get on a tremendous roll. I remember there was one novel I wrote called Familiar Strangers. Nanette and I were staying in Leslie Bricker's house in the south of France. He'd very kindly lent us. And it was unrelenting, awful weather. And I found a typewriter. I sat down and I wrote the first chapter of, without knowing where it would go at all, of Familiar Strangers, which I've always thought was my best novel.
It's kind of the muse. It just
Yes,
descends, doesn't
it's
it?
odd, isn't it? I think screenwriting is a good training
Yeah.
because if you're on salary
Yeah.
and you're in Hollywood
Yes.
and someone's paid your airfare
Yeah.
and they've given you a typewriter and a hotel room, you've bloody well got to come up with it.
I'm struck as we talk that your range of interests, your inability to resist going after things that interest you,
No.
that fascinate you. Was there any project that you wanted to get off the ground that you never could?
Oh, I think many.
Yeah. Nothing. No great grand.
Well, I suppose Napoleon and Josephine, which I worked on for a very, very long time, and at one point had a wonderful contract with the old Warner Brothers, and then they changed hands, and the new people who took over just threw it down the toilet.
Had you written it yourself?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
there are 2 bound volumes. I'd worked on it for nearly 2 years.
It is a great story, and it's extraordinary that apart from that one great film of Abel Gance, which stops in 1791, that nobody's ever really brought him to the screen.
No, they
properly.
haven't. No, and the story between him and Josephine,
Yes.
and I'd got wonderful permissions to shoot at Malmaison, and the French were very keen on it
Yeah.
and would have put money into it, but it needed a lot of money.
Yeah. You're one of the most unsentimental men that I've ever met. You're so clear about everything that's happened to you and about your life, which has been extraordinary in its ups and its downs and so on. You carved out something so individual as a filmmaker, something so personal. It's always been informed by wit, by a sense of language, a fascination with human beings, and a tone and an elegance that makes it a unique oeuvre, in my view. Well, fabulous.